It's late at night. The world outside is quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the ticking of a distant clock are the only sounds keeping you company. You're home alone, convinced that you're safe. But then, you hear it. A sound, faint, unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. You tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe the house is settling. Maybe you left a window cracked. But as the sound grows louder, your heart starts to pound. And then it hits you. You're not alone. This is the moment where fear becomes real. The stories you're about to hear are not just tales to make you shiver. They're accounts from people who lived through the unthinkable. And for them, home wasn't a sanctuary. It became a nightmare. Tonight, we'll uncover the truth behind 4 chilling, home-alone horror stories. Each one is stranger than the last. Each one harder to explain. Are you ready to step into their world? Our first story takes us to a quiet college town where a young woman named Megan was enjoying the newfound independence of living alone. She had a small apartment, cozy and unassuming, where she thought nothing bad could ever happen. But what she didn't know was that her sanctuary was hiding a secret. It started on a Thursday night. Megan had stayed up late studying for her exams. The apartment was silent except for the scratching of her pen on paper and the occasional groan of the pipes. Then she heard it, a faint sound, something she couldn't quite place. A shuffle, a creak. At first, she dismissed it. Old buildings make weird noises, she thought. But as the night went on, the sound returned. Louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from her closet. She brushed it off, laughing nervously to herself. "Maybe I left the window open," she muttered. But when she checked, the window was locked. The room was still. Too still. As the hours crept by, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She decided to open the closet, just to be sure. The door creaked open, revealing a jumble of clothes and boxes. Nothing seemed out of place. She let out a sigh of relief, closed the door, and tried to forget about it. But Megan had missed one crucial detail. Hidden behind the boxes in the corner was a trapdoor, just slightly ajar. In the days that followed, the noises grew more frequent. Footsteps when she wasn't walking, shadows flickering in her peripheral vision. Megan started to question her own sanity. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. She called a friend, begging them to come over. Together, they moved the boxes and opened the trapdoor. What they found would haunt Megan forever. Someone had been living there, watching her, waiting. When Derek moved into his new home, he felt lucky. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses neatly lined up, and everyone seemed welcoming. His next-door neighbor, Mrs. Hill, was particularly kind. She was always smiling, always waving from her garden. But something about her didn't feel right. It started with little things, odd coincidences that Derek brushed off. Whenever he came home late, the light in Mrs. Hill's window was always on, and every time he glanced outside, she was standing at her window watching. At first, he thought it was harmless. She's just a lonely old woman, he told himself. But one night, he woke up to a strange noise, a soft tapping at his bedroom window. When he pulled back the curtains, there was no one there. But on the glass, he saw something chilling, a single handprint, small and smudged, as if someone had pressed their hand against the window from the outside. Derek convinced himself it was a prank, maybe some kids in the neighborhood. But the next morning, Mrs. Hill stopped by with a pie. smiling as if nothing had happened. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone almost mocking. As the weeks went on, the strange events escalated. Doors in his home would unlock themselves. He'd hear whispers when the house was empty. And every time he stepped outside, Mrs. Hill was there, standing at her window, smiling. Derek couldn't take it anymore. He decided to dig into Mrs. Hill's past, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain her behavior. What he discovered left him paralyzed with fear. Mrs. Hill had died in that very house a decade ago. Derek's neighbor wasn't supposed to exist, and yet there she was. Emily loved her quiet, uneventful life. Living alone in her small, cozy home gave her the peace she craved. But one night, that peace was shattered by a single phone call, one that would change everything. It was nearly midnight when Emily's phone rang. She hesitated, but eventually picked it up. "Hello?" she said, but there was no response, just silence. Then, faint breathing. Unsettled, she hung up and brushed it off as a wrong number. But the calls didn't stop. Night after night, the same number would call, the same silence, the same eerie breathing. Then one night, the silence was broken. A voice that sounded familiar. It whispered her name. Emily. Emily was shaken but determined to figure out who was behind the calls. She contacted her phone company, hoping they could trace the number. But the result was unexpected. The calls were coming from her own house. Panic set in. She searched every room, every closet, but there was no sign of anyone. Still, the calls continued, and each time the whispers grew more unsettling. One night, as the calls grew unbearable, Emily finally decided to call the police. When they arrived, they found no signs of an intruder, but the officer said something that froze Emily in her tracks. "Are you sure you're the only one living here?" Emily's heart raced. The officer inspected the house one last time, and then they found it. Hidden in the attic was a makeshift living space, a mattress, empty food containers, and her old phone, rigged to call her number repeatedly. She had never been alone. For months, someone had been watching her, listening to her, whispering her name. And now, they were gone. Imagine moving in with a new roommate, someone you barely know, but who seems friendly enough. Now imagine finding out that the person you're living with isn't who they seem. Michael had just moved to the city and found a roommate online. The arrangement seemed perfect. Affordable rent, a decent location, and a quiet housemate named Eric. But it didn't take long for Michael to notice something strange. Eric was never around. Michael rarely saw him, and when he did, Eric seemed distant, almost detached. But what bothered Michael the most were the small things. Food missing from the fridge, doors unlocked when he was sure he had locked them, and the faint sound of movement late at night. One night, Michael decided to stay awake to see what was going on. He sat in the dark, waiting. Hours passed. Then, at 3 a.m., he heard it. The sound of someone creeping down the hallway. He followed the sound to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. Michael hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. He descended the stairs, step by step, until he reached the bottom. What he saw made his blood run cold. Eric wasn't living upstairs. He was living in the basement. And he wasn't alone. Hidden behind old furniture were sleeping bags, clothes, and 3 strangers, all watching Michael in silence. Michael ran upstairs and locked himself in his room, calling the police. By the time they arrived, the basement was empty. Eric was gone, and so were the others. But they had left something behind. A note taped to Michael's door that simply read, "Thanks for letting us stay." 4 stories. 4 lives forever changed by the horrors they encountered in their own homes. Are these isolated incidents? Or is there something about the safety of our homes that makes them the perfect stage for fear? If you've made it through to the end, you're braver than most. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. But remember, the scariest horrors are the ones we never see coming.